So I guess we'll begin. It's time. Welcome I'm really delighted to be able to present today's speaker for our masterclass, Vidya Dehejia. And I'm just begin by saying that this is part of the series sponsored by the South Asia Institute, part of the, it's a series over the course of this year, 2020 to 2021, South Asian Studies, The View from Colombia. I'm Catherine Ewing, the director of the South Asia Institute. Professor Dehejia is the Barbara Stoller Miller Professor of Indian Art and in the Art History and Archeology Department at Columbia. She has been at Columbia for a number of decades, and I think from reading your CV that you were here kind of at the sort of lower tiers of the professorate, and then moved for a few years to the Smithsonian Institute, where you served a variety of administrative roles, including acting director of the Sackler Gallery. And so it's been kind of an interesting trajectory, I think. And then when you came back to Columbia in 2002, shortly after that, I guess maybe a year later, actually served as the director of the South Asia Institute for about 5 years. So I want to mention that as, you know, sort of part of the heritage of this institute. In 2012, she was awarded a very prestigious award, the Padma Bhushan, by the President of India for her exceptional contributions to art and education. She has a remarkable number of books. I'll just mention a couple of the most recent. In 2016, she has the book, The Thief Who Stole My Heart, The Material Life of Sacred Bronzes from Chola, India, 855 to 1280, published by Princeton. And more recently, very recently, 2021, India, A Story Through 100 Objects. So with that, and our goal today is to hear a little bit about the trajectory of your career, and of course, whatever you want to say, but sort of putting in context what you're thinking about now. And so welcome.
Well, it's going to be a pleasure to speak about what is, of course, very dear to my heart, which is art history. But I actually started off more as an archaeologist. I was at Cambridge University in England, did the tripos in archaeology. One of the things we had to do was the university dig, which in those days was in the island of Jersey. And we would go digging, as we called it, every Easter. Every Easter, it rained every single day, every moment of the day. So we were digging wet mud. We were also digging a Paleolithic cave site. So what do you find in a Paleolithic cave site? You're going to find stones and bones if you're lucky. So it was a very different start from what I'm doing now. Why did I go to Cambridge? Well, in those days in India, you either went to Cambridge or to Oxford. The decision to go to Cambridge was sort of made for me because to do archaeology at Oxford, you had to have Greek or Latin. To do archaeology at Cambridge, you could have Greek, Latin, or Sanskrit. And I had studied Sanskrit for 4 years in school in Bombay. And so I was able to, there was no need to actually make a choice. The choice was made for me. So I was at Cambridge. I did in a way, and I don't want to dwell on this, I'd love to come back to it if anybody is interested, an extraordinarily hyphenated sort of existence in India. I went to a Church of England school. My religious text was not the Vedas, not the Puranas, it was Acts of the Apostles. The English text was Jane Austen, it was Northanger Abbey, but yet I could do Sanskrit. So, I mean, it was a very, and home life was equally sort of hyphenated, and I can talk about that if we have time and if there's interest later. But let me start by sharing the screen with you so that you can see what it is that I'm working with. Okay. So, what I thought I'd do today is to give you two of the classes that I love to teach, which are each the result of an entire book. I then thought that I would give you my glimpses into my two latest books, and in between perhaps an article that I'm actually writing. Maybe that give you a sort of an idea of the range of material that I deal with in the art history department. I'm starting with the class on visual narratives. Narrative is, of course, universal. It's transhistorical, it's transcultural. As Roland Barthes said, it just exists like life itself. But every single nation has its corpus of narratives, of stories. There are popular tales and fables, there are epics and romances, there are sacred myths and legends. And mostly we tend to think of narrative as written narrative, but of course there are two other modes. One is oral, formal oral, as well as, of course, just bedtime stories for children, which is how children in India for years used to learn the Ramayana or Mahabharata stories. And then, of course, there is visual narrative. And as I started focusing on visual narratives and realizing that very little had been done with it, and almost nothing at all had been written about visual narratives in the context of India. And so I first wrote an article in the Art Bulletin in which I sort of, after analyzing a lot of material, came up with 7 different types of narratives. Now, this might sound strange, but we take it for granted in written narrative. You know, we have novels, we have dramas, we have short story, we have a poem, we have a saga, we have an epic. There are all these names and different types of narrative. Well, there's an equal range of narrative in visual terms. And so I came up with terminology for these 7 different modes. The names are not nice and short and small like epic, poem, saga, but they have a relevance all the same. So let's look at some more of this type of material. It's obvious that you could take the same story and tell it in different ways verbally. You can also do the same visually. And here are 2, for instance, different ways of presenting the same narrative. It's the great departure of the Buddha. The Buddha has been confined within his palace. His father doesn't want him to leave the palace and go off in search of his enlightenment. And here are 2 different artists who are giving you 2 very different ways of presenting this story. What I call the one on the top is monoscenic narrative, in which a single theme captures the entire narrative. It means that you've got to tell yourself the story up to there, and then you focus on it, and then you continue, and you have to, again, tell yourself the end of the story. The artist down below has used a completely different mode. You can still see the Buddha on the top is on his horse as he rides away, the parasol, the regal parasol above him. And you can see that the guards who wanted to help him to escape are actually there holding up the hooves of the horses so that he can get away without waking up the guards who have all been cast into a sort of a miraculous sleep for those few moments that he is leaving the palace. When you look down here, you see what I have called continuous narrative. Continuous narrative flows continuously over the available space. It's the artist's idea is to give you various phases of that same story. He wants to lay it out for you. He wants you to follow the story. So there is, once again, the horse. There is the regal parasol. For the moment, I'm not going to go into this. Please believe me when I say there is the absent presence of the Buddha. He's not represented in anthropomorphic form, in human form. It's empty space beneath that parasol that represents his presence. This is a whole issue which we won't go into today. Just believe me for the moment. But watch how the story unravels. You see the horse and the rider, the absent rider, the parasol is there, leaving the palace gates. You then see the horse moving further on. Movement in space and time. It is space and time that's the most difficult and most tricky element in visual narrative. You don't have a wonderful stage in which you can show space and time. You've got the static piece of stone or a painted wall or a painted page on which you have to represent this. And you do it by representing that same figure. So it's the single figure, the protagonist, who is repeated. And when you see that repetition, you immediately say, oh, continuous narrative, which is in fact the most popular mode of visual narrative. So the horse and rider have risen further away, and they have risen further away. You keep looking at the parasol. And then when you go to the far end, you notice a pair of footprints and the parasol. The Buddha has dismounted. He's reached as far as he wants to go, and he dismounts. And then you have the horse without the parasol, without the rider, with the groom leading it back to the palace from which, so you've got the movement in the opposite direction. Continuous narrative is absolutely the most favorite, one of the most favorite modes. And whenever you see the repetition of the figure, you really have to stop and say, no, these are not 5 different horses. It's the same horse. It's in slightly different space and time. As you look at that panel down below and then look at the Garfield panel up above, what have I done with the Garfield panel? All I've done is to remove these little black lines, which suggest each of these is in a separate little enclosed box. And once you remove those lines, you've got continuous narrative. You're seeing not 3 Johns and 3 Garfields. They are the same person in a slightly different space and a slightly different moment of time. And by the way, all visual narrative depends on a knowing viewer. For somebody who doesn't know anything about Garfield and John and that Garfield lives to eat, the panel up on top would make no sense. Same thing down here. You know the story of the great departure of the Buddha, and that's why you can decipher it quite as easily. I also want to show you one other mode of narrative that I called synoptic. It's a confusing form of visual narrative in which there's no indication of where you're going to start or where you're going to end. Ultimately, you have to know the story. You spend some time. When you wonder why the artist gives you such a complex mode, it could be that they really want you to focus on the story. There's always a moral in these stories. This is a Jataka story of the Buddha's previous life as Chaddanta with 6 tusks, the 6-tusked elephant. And this is one way of involving you in unraveling that story and then contemplating the moral of the story. So you're starting in this case where you've got the number one, the six-tusked elephant with his queens and his followers. Then they go into the two of them, the three of them, two queens and the king go into the lotus pond. The Chadanta gives a lotus to his chief queen. The junior queen is mortally offended. She gets out of the pond. She lies down to die and promises revenge in the next birth. In the next birth, she's born as the Queen of Benares. That part of the story isn't here. The artists choose what they're going to actually focus on and let you fill in the bits in between. But she, as Queen of Benares, she's sort of says, well, she puts out a notice for a great reward for the tusks of a six-tusked elephant. And there's only one, the Buddha in a previous life. So here is number 5. The hunter is down here. He has managed to capture the elephant into a confined space. Here he is sawing off the tusks, and here you can see him with 6 tusks departing. This is part of the story, not the entire story, but a type of narrative where it is left to the viewer to unravel entirely and to find out where the story might start and where it ends in a particular panel. One last mode of narrative I'd like to talk to you about is the narrative network. Now, here is a Ramayana page. It's a small page. It's just about the size of 8 by 11. It's even narrower. It's not all of 8. And you've got the story of Indrajit, who is, of course, Ravana's son, and his trickery, as I call it, because he's the one who can get his arrows to turn into serpents. If you look at the far left, you can see that Rama, painted bright blue, and Lakshmana, whitish, are bound by these snakes. And this is, of course, the arrows that Indrajit from up here has let loose. But there are, as you look at this page, the artist has really got a network in space and time. And it is only when you know the story that you actually follow it through. And here's how you would follow it. You start at the very center where Indrajit enters with his retinue. And Indrajit is wearing an orange-red gold-flecked dhoti and a gold top and then a gold helmet. And as you follow him, you see Indrajit a second time. This is how you follow most of these narratives, by each repeated representation of that same figure. So you see him a second time, then you see him a third time as he embraces his brother. Then you move down and the two of them are sitting, they're planning what to do, because Ravana doesn't know how to defeat Rama. And this is when Indrajit says, I've got a plan. And there he is again, once again, leaving the palace. So that's 5 times you've seen Indrajit. You're going to see him one more time, because there he is up in his aerial chariot shooting those arrows. What's the rest of the page got? It's got Sita. She's in the forest, in the vana, and she's by herself. And then Trijata, the Rakshasi, comes to her and says, you might as well give in to Ravana, because your husband and his brother are dead. And she says, I refuse to believe you. And she says, get into my chariot, I'll show you. And so your page continues up on top as they leave the palace in the chariot up here. But they haven't yet reached, it's the last piece of the puzzle of the page, where they get right above and Trijata points out and says, look, there he is, he's dead. Narrative networks are fascinating. And in the case of this particular manuscript, the artist tells us that he made it for the viewing pleasure of Rana Jagat Singh. So he knew what he was doing. It's a story, everybody knows the Ramayana story. And instead of presenting it so simply when it would be almost tedious and boring and you might just turn the pages, He presents a page which involves you, the viewer. You have to stop and say, well, what on earth is happening on this page? And it involves you very much more in what the artist calls viewing pleasure in this case. One last example of the narrative network, and I'm taking you to the caves at Ajanta, to cave 16. I'm going to take you to a panel which is all along the right side interior of the cave. It's very difficult to photograph, so I haven't even tried to photograph it. Instead, I'm giving you a line drawing, and I've numbered it in the way in which we are used to numbering things. We number things according to the time that they occur. So you would say 1, 2, 3, 4 happens early, 21, 22, 23 happens late. But let's look a little bit more at the numbering here. And you will notice that you've got 20 is here on the wall. By the way, these are the doorways into the cells. So this is a whole painted wall with doors into the cells at the caves of Ajanta. You've got 20 here. You've got 21, 22, 23 here. And then you've gone back here for 24. What's happening? What we find in much of narrative network and narrative in India on this scale is that the artist is not going by time that something occurs, but is going by topographical, the space in which something occurred. So what is happening here? This is the space of the palace. So everything that happens in the palace is put in here. This is space in the town just outside the palace, and this is space further away from the palace. So how do we interpret 20? Siddhartha, the young prince, the Buddha to be, is in the palace with his wife. This is then the 3 rides away, as people who know Buddhist story will know that he goes out and he sees a sick man, a dead man, a monk, and he then decides it's time to abandon the world. So these are the 3 rides far outside, 1, 2, and 3, 21, 22, 23. Then he goes back to the palace. So 24 is on that side. I know it sounds strange, but think of it this way. We're so used to this. 1, 2, 3. We could say that those 1, 2, 3, if you were going to portray your day on a wall like this or on a page like this, 1, 2, and 3 might be you wake up, you brush your teeth, you have breakfast, and then your 4 wouldn't be here, it would be here because maybe you go for a run outside, or you take the dog for a walk. Then 4 would be out here because you're far away. You're coming back maybe to pack up lunch, so then that portion would be back in your home, and then you would go to Colombia, so Colombia would be out here. So it is topographical planning rather than temporal that very often is the clue to how you unravel these narratives. Let me move to a second course, which is based on another book that I wrote, which is called The Body Adorned. And we use that book as one of the basic books for the course on the body. And in it, one of the important things, I'm going to give you just little glimpses. As you can imagine, it's difficult, but I'll try. The body is the leitmotif. The body is the most important thing in the art of India. Everything centers around the body. The space is there in which things unravel, but they are very marginally, very minimally depicted. It is that human body, that major human body that is the focus of the artist and of the viewer as well. I mean, if you want an example, here is an example as a contrast from China, Poet on a Mountain. You have to search for that poet on the mountain. Instead, if you look at a teacher in the forest in India, you have to search for the forest. Yes, there's a little bit of green there, and there's a couple of deer. So you sort of know they're setting the scene, but it's the human figures that always take center stage. And the human figure is important, and the figure of woman in particular is extremely important. I want to take you very briefly to a single site, that of Barhut, which you are seeing on the right. It is a railing around a stupa which no longer exists, and the railing has been reconstructed within the Indian Museum in Calcutta, which is what you're seeing on the right. And I'm giving you a stupa, I'm giving you the Sanchi stupa on the left, so that you could just imagine the way in which this railing that you're going to look at sort of encircle the stupa. At Sanchi, the railing is absolutely plain. This is a richly carved railing. And here are some of the figures that are carved on the pillars of that railing around a Buddhist stupa where you are going to approach it to get proximity to the relics of the Buddha, which, as Gregory Chopin has pointed out, in some mysterious way contain the essence of the Buddha. And yet you are finding these very sensuous figures on the columns around them. And one of the immediate responses is to talk of the male gaze. And that is totally irrelevant in this context. And it's not just that I'm saying that it's irrelevant. The artists, the sculptors have helped us because there are inscriptions on every one of these pieces. And as we look at them, this first one is labeled Chanda Yakshi, so the moon Yakshi. And it tells us that that pillar was given, the inscription is right there on the along the image. It was given by the Reverend Buddha Rakita, who has abandoned all attachment. So think of it, think of what it's saying. Here is Sirima Devata. And this pillar was donated, was commissioned by a woman, not by any ordinary woman, but by a Buddhist nun. Or look at this of Chulakoka Devata, she's called. And she has been given by a venerable monk whose name is Pantaka. Or look at the fourth image, Sudarshana Yakshi. You can see, by the way, you can see if you look carefully, you've got to you've got to turn your neck like this to read it. But the inscriptions are all there, right there next to the figure. And Sudarshana Yakshi was donated by the Reverend monk Kanaka, who is a preacher of the law. He's a Bhanaka, so he's also a preacher of the law. It makes you, and I'm not going to go into this, it's a whole chapter in my book, The Body Adorned. You have to look at the figure differently and realize that when monastics are commissioning images like this, it gives you a completely different look at the importance of those figures of women and how you should understand them as auspicious figures, as Shubha, Mangala, etc. But no time for that. I want to show you one other little snippet from this book so that you can look at these images. Both these are images of Shiva with Parvati. Both come from Madhya Pradesh. Both of them show them as a loving couple. In the image on the right, you can see that Shiva's arm is cupping Parvati's breast. Parvati's arm is over his proper right shoulder. They are a loving couple seated close together. The one on the left, there is actually, Shiva is raising Parvati's chin so that he can look into her eyes. What does it mean to have images of this type? You know, there's a huge number of inscriptions in India which just have not been looked at in detail. Some inscriptions are on the image itself, like the ones we just looked at Barhut. Others are inscriptions on stones and copper plates, which are which basically are recording a donation of a temple or of money to Brahmins or to a temple again. And they give us every single inscription in India, which is usually looked at because it may have a king's name and give you a date. Never mind the king's name and the date. It starts with a verse that talks about the god and goddess. And many, many of them talk about the love between the god and goddess. And I have a couple of them here. For instance, this is one from it's a Kalinjar stone inscription, celebrates the foundation of the temple to Shiva in Uttar Pradesh in the year 1201. And it starts this way. May Ishvara, that is Shiva, who experienced the delight of an embrace from Parvati, multiply your excessive delight. These are often repeated in different words. So what it is saying is that it is suggesting that composing a verse about the love of Parvati and Shiva, or creating an image depicting the love of Shiva and Parvati, will bring you that same blessing. Think of it in terms of prasada. When you go to a temple, you take with you maybe bananas, maybe coconut, maybe flowers. They are offered ritually by the priest to the image. The image is said to bless them. It's given back to you, a certain portion of it is given back to you. Think of this in the same way. You have donated either a verse or an image to a temple. It is being accepted by the temple blessed, and that blessing, that same marital bliss, is being given back to you. That's what these inscriptions are all saying. And it's not just Shiva. I'm showing you Shiva. Here's one from a Vishnu temple from Kotwa, again in UP, dated to 1197 during the reign of Harshachandra of Kanauj. And this is what it says: may Lakshmi's hand, which is caressing the neck of Vishnu, grant you happiness. So every time it is referring to the love of the divine couple, but also then saying that may that blessing come to you. Okay, let's move on. Let's move on to a set of lectures that I gave called the Andrew Mellon Lectures. They are a set of 6 lectures at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And I gave the lectures in 2016. The book is just out. I've got my advance copy, and it is supposed to be next month available. The 6 lectures that I gave, they were the 65th of the Andrew Mellon Lectures. So it's been going on for 65 years at that time. And it's, of course, the very first year. It won't surprise you in the least bit to know that it's the very first year that India was ever represented in these lectures. I want to talk about the title and the subtitle that you're looking at here. The thief who stole my heart is the figure that you're looking at, Shiva. And it is child Saint Samandar who sings of Shiva as the thief who stole his heart. There is in South India, by the way, I'm a Tambram, and so the thief who stole my heart is Yen Ullam Kavar Kalwan. The child Saint Samandar's verses, 300 songs, start the Tamil. I should be careful about using the word canon. I'm going to use it loosely. It's the Tamil canon of South India. And his very first hymn describes the beauty of Shiva and calls him, it's the refrain of each of the verses of his first song, Yenullam Kavar Kalvan, the thief who stole my heart. And it describes the beauty of Shiva and his glory, and calls him in each of those the thief who stole my heart. And the images of Chola bronzes are such absolutely exquisite images that it felt to me that this was an appropriate title for the book. And I will show you the same image in detail in a minute. But while I have the book cover in front of you, I want to just address the subtitle, which is actually exceedingly important. The material life of sacred bronzes. Yes, we are going to delight in the sheer physical beauty of Shiva and of Uma and so on. But the idea in this book is to also go beyond the sensuous, that these bronzes are material objects that interact in meaningful ways with human activities, with socioeconomic circumstances, and of course with the sacred. I have so many questions that I raise in this book and try to address. What are the economic circumstances that permitted these Chola temples and Chola bronzes? Agricultural wealth, okay, but how did that agricultural wealth come about? The irrigation systems, each of these are important parts of this. What about all the jewelry that we're going to see in a few minutes? Gold and semi-precious stones that were not made to adorn the king and the queen. Yes, they must have worn some, but which we hear about in the inscriptions as adorning, were created for the sacred bronzes. What was the source of copper? Why was there an obsession with Sri Lanka? Why are there so many inscriptions on these temples? These are some of the questions that I approach and raise in the course of this book and the course of the 6 lectures, which ended up as a 10-chapter book. Here is the entire figure from which that detail was taken. And as you can see, it's a 4-piece group of the marriage of Shiva and Uma. And the 2 other figures on the far right is, of course, Vishnu. And on the far left is Lakshmi, his consort. Why is Vishnu here? Because in South India, and South India alone, Vishnu is the brother of Uma. And so you have him attending the wedding and his consort serving as friend and confidant of Uma. And these are figures that are almost 4 feet high. They are absolutely spectacular images. And it is each of the sets of bronzes, each temple, a small temple would have had about 10 bronzes because these all participate in festival activities. Each month there is at least one major festival. The festival of, when you have the festival of the marriage of Shiva and Parvati, you've got to use an image which depicts the marriage of Shiva and Parvati. You can't use any old image, nor can you reuse this image for any other festival. So it is for one festival, made for that festival. As you can see, it is taking the hand, panigrahana, taking the hand in marriage, an absolutely exquisite bronze. And one other thing I'd like to point out is the extraordinary empathy of the sculptor. There is that shy bride, richly decked, both of them. She's hesitating slightly behind, she's not looking at Shiva, and look at her friend and confidant, using both her hands to move her gently from both sides towards her bridegroom. It's an extraordinary gesture that he should have bothered, that the sculptor should have bothered to bring this out in so exquisite a manner in these beautiful images. Let's talk about copper. The Dancing Shiva that you're looking at in the Cleveland Museum of Art, I asked Cleveland, I needed to know the weight of the image, and they said, my God, we're going to have to bring a crane in. And I said, well, okay, If by any chance you can do it before I give my lectures, please let me know how much it weighs. It's 257 pounds because Chola bronzes are solid bronzes. They are solid copper. They don't have hollow interiors, quite unlike, say, Roman, Greek, Roman, or Renaissance bronzes, or today's Rodin bronzes, which are all hollow. Chola bronzes are totally solid. So, and if each temple has at least 12 images, larger temples have 25, and royal temples have 60 and over. Where is the copper coming from? I worked out that in just the 3 districts of the central Kaveri basin, Tanjavur, Trichy, Tanjavur, and Nagapattinam, you require 153 tons of copper for the bronzes, just in those 3 districts, and that by no means is the Chola Empire. Where did the copper come from? There is not something that I myself had never focused on, but nobody has focused on. There is no copper in Tamil Nadu. There is no copper that can be profitably mined in Tamil Nadu. Where did all this copper come from? Not just for the images, but also for the copper plates, which have these inscriptions. Where did the copper come from? While I was told that this is one of the most difficult things to focus on, I think I came up with a possible answer, which is that it came from nearby Sri Lanka. It's an important factor because sacred images carried in procession are known from about 600, but those must all have been of wood. And around 855, suddenly, everything is in copper. So there must have been a nearby source of copper which was available. Another feature is jewelry, which I was fascinated by because inscriptions, the inscriptions on the Tanjavur temple, you could write a complete jewelry handbook from the inscriptions. They tell you every single piece of jewelry that's given, and usually the jewelry is given by a donor in sets, head to toe, the crown and all the way down to the toe rings. So a complete set of jewels. And you can see that they are already, the image, as you can see on the left, is already adorned in the bronze, right? It's got all its multiple necklaces and armlets and bangles and earrings and anklets and everything. But look at the image on the right. That is how an image is adorned for a festival with actual jewelry. And South Indian temples have huge amounts of jewels. So here is one example of the type of inscription and the type of jewelry that was created. I'm giving you an example from the Tanjavur temple, so around the year 1000 of this era. Now, I'm giving you this example just after telling you, look, there is the armlet in bronze indicated in great detail on the figure of Uma. Here is a bracelet, a gold bracelet. The bracelet I'm talking to you about is not just a gold bracelet. Here is the rest of the inscription. It tells you how many diamonds are set into it, how many rubies, how many strung pearls. It also tells you the exact nature of each of these pieces of jewelry, that they are diamonds, flat diamonds with smooth edges, square diamonds, bluish rubies, unpolished rubies, roundish pearls, small pearls, huge amount of information. One of the things that they seem to have been exceedingly fond of was pearls. And here from a temple treasury is a pearl crown for the goddess. When she wears her hair in a large knot on one side, that's the way the whole thing has been styled. And pearls were very important. And here is an example of one gold diadem. A diadem is the patam. The patam is this sort of band across the forehead. One gold diadem given by Rajaraja. Here's the inscription, 13,328 pearls. Look at them. Every type of pearl, small pearls, nimbalam, payatam, ambubudu, crude pearl, twin pearls, sapati, sakatu, pearls of brilliant water, pearls of red water. One of the reasons for the Chola obsession with Sri Lanka have been the pearl fisheries in the water between the Chola Pandya region and Sri Lanka. The pearl banks, the main pearl banks are right there. With the southwest monsoon, the oyster pearl beds are moved a little towards Sri Lanka, and they nestle near Mannar at the head of the Aravi River. And then when the northeast monsoon comes back, some of them are moved back towards here. Control over these pearl fisheries would have been very, very important for the Cholas, and could have been one of three reasons. I won't go into the other two reasons for this total obsession with Sri Lanka. And then there are the inscriptions, the last of the little bits of glimpses I'm going to give you about this particular book. You know, every temple wall is covered with these inscriptions, literally covered with them. It didn't happen with the Pallava rulers before. It didn't happen with the rulers after, but it happens at this particular stage. Everything to do with the temple is inscribed on the temple. Everything to do with the temple. And it's like a mantle covering the temple walls. If there's a sculpture, the inscriptions will then go around, above, both sides of the sculpture and down. They even went to the extent of putting them on grill windows, like you see here. An extraordinary thing. And what do these inscriptions say? Just about anything and everything connected with the temple. For instance, we read that at the Shivapuram temple, a priest took the pearl necklace intended for the goddess and gave it to a concubine. He was found, he was tried, he was found guilty of sin against both Shiva and the king. So it's Raja Droha and Shiva Droha. And they confiscated all his property, and then we move into sort of legal terms, movable property and immovable property, it tells us. And these were sold, and the money from it was given to the temples to make fresh jewelry for the goddess. Jewels were very important. The figure was, you couldn't have too much of a good thing. The jewels were already there in the bronze, but you had to add lush, exuberant jewelry over it. And there's one of the inscriptions talks about what we today call eminent domain, because, you know, when a city, I guess, takes over certain property for public purposes. In this case, it's a temple. The temple was having these huge processions. The street in front of the temple had become too narrow. So the king ordered that all the houses on one side of the street should be demolished. But he then lays out in that inscription, which is on the temple walls, like all these inscriptions you're looking at, that it should be that adequate housing should be provided to all the dispossessed owners, that they should be in good condition, that the adequate repairs should be made to those houses, etc., etc. Everything to do with the temple. Why do they use their temple walls as a public records office? Nice big question. I have many more questions, but I want to move on, seeing what the time is. very quickly. This is an article still in the works. I'm not sure what I'll call it. It's actually about the transference of themes across media. I might finally call it Whose Taste, or it might have a completely different sort of title. But what am I talking about? I'm talking about the 19th century. I'm starting with the 18th century and giving you an example of two British artists who traveled in India and who went around, Thomas and William Daniel, and came up with a series of aquatins, which they got together in a volume called Oriental Scenery. And Oriental Scenery was extremely popular in England, so much so that Staffordshire blue and white porcelain began to be made featuring scenes from Oriental scenery. So here you've got Charlie's Satoon in Allahabad, which no longer exists as a centerpiece here. And in the background is the great pagoda, as they called it, at Trichy, the rock fort at Trichy. And these were not single pieces, by the way. They were made in, a set of plates were made, the whole service, soup tureens, sauce boats, everything that the British used was made with these scenes. And I give you just one more example of it. Here is the same Thomas and William Daniels. Here's their Chitpur Road in Calcutta, and here's a banyan tree at Gaya. And here's your Chitpur Road used in the center, and then the tree. But this is not what I'm going to focus on. I might do a little bit with it. I'm actually focusing on Raja Ravi Varma. And we all know his famous, buxom, fair-skinned beauties. The gods that we know today are all based on, in calendar pictures, et cetera, all based on Ravi Varma and his naturalistic tendency, of course, with the receding river, et cetera, et cetera. These two images, among many others, okay, so these two images were made for the Gaikwad of Baroda. They wouldn't have been seen by people. But we know that Ravi Varma established his own oleographic press. And then these were repeated by the dozens and became available, right? So here is a silver tea set made by Peter Orr and Sons in Madras. And Madras silver, the British referred to them as Swami silver. They got the word Swami. The gods, because like everything else, they did have the gods on this silver. And as you look at it, you can see here on the left is the oil, on the right is one of the many prints made of it. So you've got that same figure seated on the rock, peacock on the thing, everything is being imitated. And you can see up on top, there is Lakshmi standing on a lotus with the elephant on one side of her, holding lotuses. And the little line drawing that you have here, not a very fine piece of work, but it comes from a silver workshop itself, where they made their own drawing from the oleograph. There are dozens of these, and I'd love to have shown you many more, but I'm not going to. And one of these days, I'm going to sit down and finish writing this article. Okay, my fifth and last piece is a book that's just gone to press. It's been great fun to write. It really has been, because I have been working at the same time as this with the Thief Who Stole My Heart, which was a completely different type of immersion. And this has been great fun to do. It's things. We're constantly surrounded by objects, by things that channel our everyday life, that dictate our everyday life, things that we take for granted. But all the objects around us speak to us, they speak about us, they have a story to tell. story that reflects our values, our aspirations, our achievements, our dreams. And they reveal more about us than we realize, actually. Look around you afterwards and think about it. So the idea of this book was to focus on 100 objects, to tell a story in which the objects take center stage and speak directly to us, so that this book unravels in a series of thematic sections. Now, the stories that some objects tell you are likely to be new to you, perhaps this very one, as you see it more in detail. At other times, the objects themselves may be familiar, but the story that they tell may not be that obvious. So what I tried to do is to put together a book where the objects, the 100 objects, shed light on the varying priorities we have had, the differing strands of achievement that arose over time, to create what I insist on calling the rich, multicultural medley that is today's India. So if we look at this, it is actually, I'm not going to go into it in great detail, it is a Shah Jahan piece. It has Shah Jahan's Ruzbihan written on the back of the falcon is sitting on a perch, and on the back of the perch, you can't quite see it here, but it is there, is the word Ruzbihan. And he was the chief jeweler who looked after all Shah Jahan's own precious objects. So it is possible that this was an object that Shah Jahan himself owned. And it is, of course, this absolutely exquisite object. And the falcon, one has to remember that in the Sufi tradition, the falcon returning to perch on the fist of its owner was interpreted as the bewildered soul returning at peace to the Lord. It's an interesting issue. How was it used? It's fairly large. There's a hole at the bottom, which has been used to stick a rod through. Maybe Shah Jahan actually kept it beside him. But the jeweled work is the jeweled work of Rajasthan. It's an absolutely wonderful piece. Let me show you another of my real favorite pieces. This ivory figurine, and it says Naples Museum. That's not a misprint. It is in the Naples Museum. Why on earth is it in the Naples Museum? It was discovered in Pompeii. It was covered in AD 79 by Vesuvius when it erupted. So this is an image that is part of the very rich trade with the Mediterranean, between India and the Mediterranean, in as early, well before AD 79, when it got it sort of under the ashes of Vesuvius. And it was discovered only in 1938. It is the absolute visual counterpart of all the yakshis at the Sanchi Stupa. And very interestingly, the Sanchi Stupa has got an inscription which tells us that the ivory carvers of Vidisha, the nearby town, made a particular panel there. So we know that ivory work was going on there, and it's probably made by those ivory carvers. It got all the way to the Mediterranean as part of the trade. There was trade in elephant tusks, which we hear of from the Muziris papyrus. There was also huge trade in pepper, which you all know about. So the pepper trade was a student who recently finished his dissertation at Cambridge found a Roman recipe book, 500 recipes. Only 5 of them do not use pepper, and pepper came from India. There was a huge amount of pepper going that way as well. So the idea of Vesuvius, which is, here's Pompeii, and you can see Vesuvius in the distance behind it. We've rarely had we know of this trade from Pliny complaining that all the gold of Rome was going into India because the Roman women wanted the fine muslin of India, etc., etc. But it's very rare to find an actual object which we can prove to be of a particular date or before a particular date. So it's one of my favorite pieces, and obviously it had to feature in these intercultural encounters. India was never isolated from the Western world or from the Eastern world, much more. It was never isolated from the Western world, certainly. Um, in fact, what was her purpose is the next thing that somebody might wonder about. And she was probably part of a piece of furniture. There is a hole that goes through her head. And she was probably, if you can imagine, a wonderful throne-like chair, which had little, was made of wood, but had ivory inserts for the back of the chair, of this sort of throne, shall I call it. And we've got evidence that there was a guild that was a combined guild. This is Roman material, a combined Roman guild of cypress wood carvers and ivory carvers, that they worked together. So they obviously made ivory decoration themselves from all the ivory tusks that were being exported, but they also obviously imported some pieces like this and used them. Well, yeah, I mean, you could see from this that I'm you know, I should look at the clock and ask you when you want me to stop, but I will give you definitely at least this one, which comes under a thematic section that I called Indian Ocean Networks. It is, I've given you a lot of information about it. It is marble. It's made in Kambat, in Cambay, in Gujarat, belongs to the 15th century, but it was not found in Gujarat. It was found in Aden, and it's in the British Museum in London. There was a roaring trade at this time. Ivory tombstones, also mirabs, believe it or not, large mirabs, and this is a large tombstone, that were going from Kambat, which at this time, of course, was under Muslim rule. We had a Muslim Sultanate of Gujarat. And it was going Cenotaphs and Mirabs. So where do we find them? We've got 2 cenotaphs in Trincomalee in Sri Lanka, 12 of them in Sumatra, 3 in Eastern Java. And to the west, there are tombstones in Tanzania, in Somalia, in Oman, and there are mirabs at Oman and at Lar in coastal Iran. And what do we find out? Most of these tombstones suggest that they are dignitaries. One is even an imam. They were responsible for the commission and importing into their countries of tombstones which were being made in Kambat. Once again, this sort of trade and by the way, we looked at inscriptions on Chola temples. Those are inscribed into the stone. This is a completely different and very complicated tradition of flat carving of the inscription, which you can see, but it is exquisitely done, and done as exquisitely as those you might find in what you think of as primarily Muslim nations. So the carvers who were doing this were very skilled at what they were doing. Do you want one more? I couldn't resist putting this one in. I just couldn't. It's known. In the art historical world, it's certainly known. It might be known in the world of religion too. But to think of, well, we all know that Akbar was one of these people who was extremely curious about other religious traditions, that he invited the Jesuits, among others, that he also invited the Jains and the Zoroastrians to come so that he could have discussions with them about religion. And in the course of that, he ended up, this is an album page. Album pages are like scrapbooks. They contain images that are pasted so that you have the image of Jahangir and the little white, on the white place here, you've got the name of the artist. It says Hashim. So Hashim painted that, but he didn't paint this lower one. This one is painted by Abul Fazl, who was known as Nadir al-Zaman, the wonder of his age. And it's not his name, Abul Fazl, but wonder of his age that's written out there. Here is also, it says savior of the poor for Jesus. 2 separate images, pasted on, and then pasted onto a larger page, probably maybe in end of his reign, maybe the reign of the next ruler, maybe in Shah Jahan's reign. It looks more Shah Jahan, the borders. So you've got this album page, which again tells you the quality, of course, is fantastic, but it also tells you of the curiosity, of the willingness to engage with other traditions, the interest. Maybe it's not a religious interest. None of them were going to become Christians, as the Jesuits were always hoping. Their letters of the Jesuits from the Mughal court tells you that they were always hoping, because of the interest of these emperors, that they would become. But they, of course, they were interested in it as different subject matter. They were also interested in it just as a different tradition. Okay, I will show you very briefly two more things and stop. And I want to show you, of course, on the right is a typical Ganesha. It's an ivory one from Orissa, but on the left, the really, really large one. Yes, of course you recognize it as Ganesha, but look at those skulls on which he is sitting, and look at the skulls that adorn him, adorn his crown, adorn as his ear, as a earring, and the fabric. You probably may not be able to see it clearly, but the fabric is also skulls. And this comes from Eastern Java, where and we know that Southeast Asia has taken both Hinduism and Buddhism, but developed them along in their own way in each of these. If you look at a Ganesha, you can tell a Ganesha from Indonesia, which is different from a Ganesha from Cambodia, which is different from a Ganesha from Vietnam. They're all different. They came at a certain stage and then were developed in their own locations in different ways, so that you have a different artistic tradition. You'll always recognize it as Ganesha, but you will find it a strange Ganesha. So here, in this Eastern Java, they had the Singasari dynasty ruling at that time, and they thought, yes, he's the remover of obstacles, but the obstacles were their enemies. They taught them particularly for that. And therefore, here is the person who's going to help you to win battles over your enemies. Last image that I'll show you. Jatakas, Panchatantra. Panchatantra story of talking animals, I guess you could talk about them. So are the Jatakas, many of them, and talking animals with human characteristics. And you see this tortoise being carried by two geese. And that's what you see at the very top of this page of the Anvari Suhaili, which was painted in Iran in 1593. You're seeing something of about the year 800. I don't know where the label has gone. It might have gone below the image by mistake. And this is from Java. Central Java, from Chandi Mendut, a Buddhist temple quite close to Borobudur, about the year 800, and you see again the tortoise and the two geese carrying it. You know the story. The pond in which they were living was drying up. They decided that they couldn't leave their tortoise behind. The two geese said, okay, you hang on to this stick, never open your mouth, and we will take you to safety. And of course, this is the talkative tortoise that, of course, finally, with all the villagers pointing up and saying, I wonder if he's being kidnapped. I wonder what's happening. What a strange thing. And the tortoise opens his mouth to answer, of course. And that's the end of the story. But what I wanted to say really was that it's amazing how the story of the Panchatantra and of the Jatakas made their way through Old Pahlavi, into which it was translated perhaps around 550, then into the Arabic version Kalilava Dimna, which is the name of the two original jackals who told the original Panchatantra story. Then it was written around the year 1500 by Kashepi, who put it, the Persian version, who put it into a book which he called the Anvari Suhaili. And the Anvari Suhaili came back to India quite early, and the Mughal emperors liked it so much that they made a Mughal copy of it. So a story which originated somewhere in India with Jatakas and Panchatantra and went in extraordinary ways across the Middle East and then returned back to India with the Mughal emperors. It is a real multicultural medley and a country that was never isolated and which seemed at various stages to be really open to different ideas, different artistic ideals, different ways of looking at the world. Anyway, that's to say I've had a lot of fun with this book, and this one will probably be also out next month. I've been hoping that it might be used as a jump-off point or a starting point for all those many schools that wouldn't ever have somebody teaching any story of India, whether it's art historical or historical, who might be able to sort of use some of this and I mean in India too, who might be able to use some of this. At the end of the book, I've got one and sometimes two most important readings that somebody could pick up and follow a little further to, to flush it out. But here's what I decided I would try and share as little snippets with you today. And I seem to, here, let me see if I can stop the share. And maybe we can talk if there are people who would like.
I think that would be great. Unfortunately, we had a couple of people who had to go, but we do still have people, and I have some questions, I guess, coming from a very different discipline. But thank you.
Oh, there we are.
I just want to thank you so much for a really rich presentation of you really have done exactly what I was thinking about, of really hearing people's intellectual trajectories. And yours has been a really fascinating one. So thank you so much. So I do have some questions that I want to raise, but first let me open the floor and see if anybody else has some thoughts, questions, reactions. Or I'll leave it there. I'll start with one maybe, so that we can and you all can be thinking about what you want to pursue further. You made a comment fairly early on when you were showing us the statues of women, and sort of the naked women, basically, to use a sort of non-culturally sensitive description, and you suggested that some viewers, I don't know, scholars, I assume, perhaps feminist scholars as well, have discussed them in terms of they're representing a male gaze. And then you're really in fascinating richness showing us the very different intentions of the patrons who commissioned these works. And I think that's a really excellent point, but I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more, and the impact of sort of this kind of lens that sees such images as products of a male gaze, and just kind of more generally about the human body and sort of constraints on displaying it, and how we perceive that today, maybe how the colonial gaze has affected our perception of these earlier images, et cetera. I just want to kind of open up that issue.
Well, part of the problem was also there are some wonderful studies which come out of film in which it is the male gaze that is projected on by the filmmaker. And it's been shown how that works. And anyone who has read that type of literature is automatically going to say, oh, this must be the male gaze. This has to be for the pleasure of the male gaze. And it can sometimes take time to tell people that we are in a different sort of context. We also have to think of the fact that this is the 1st century BCE. That there was no, we're in a internet era. We have an overload of the visual. We can pull any visual up anytime that we want. We put yourself into the place for thousands of years when there was no such thing as a camera, when there was no such thing unless you made a picture of something yourself. If you wanted to see an image, you had to make a trip to the site where that image was. So it's got to be taken in a different way, that it was important. Anything that was carved was something important. It took a lot of time, it took a lot of effort, it took a lot of energy. And in order for it to be appreciated as well. So yes, all of modern accessibility to images has also got to be forgotten, which is a very difficult thing to try and do because we're really inundated with imagery today. We just put it aside. It's not even important anymore. It's just there. It's available. In the context of India and in the context of both Buddhism and Hinduism, we find that images which we would have normally thought of as, what should I call them? You could call them sensuous, you could call them profane, you could call them anything but sacred. They don't seem to be sacred, but they are important. They're important images and they are placed within sacred structures. There wasn't this huge distinction that a number of religions have between the sacred and the profane. That there is the secular images, non-sacred images find a major place in sacred structures because woman herself was considered, through her fertility, was considered Shubha, Mangala. If you say auspicious, it's such a clumsy English word. But if you say Shubha or Mangala, it's sort of takes on more meaning. It became an auspicious figure to be placed, a figure that was fertility which stood for abundance, for prosperity, for all the things that are good. And she was one of those objects that was to be placed on monuments of any type, whether it was a Buddhist stupa, a Buddhist chaitya hall like Karle, we walk in, there are couples. That these were figures that would bring fortune to a temple. There's a lot of literature which I have gone into in this context, but the auspiciousness is the feature. The other point is that we find them everywhere. You find them on a Buddhist monument in Nagarjunakonda, where you find couples or single figures of women in a very prominent place. It's not there by accident. It's in at eye level. Are these panels. They are placed there because they're important, because they stand for fertility, they stand for Shubha and Mangala and all of that. And they bring fortune to it. It should be there. It's a necessary feature. And by the time we get to about the 11th century, we have the texts which tell us that she must be placed on a monument. And these are the 16 types of women best placed on a monument. So in the beginning, we don't have the literature, we just get the evidence. And then by the 11th century, literature has actually survived. I should say it has survived. It might have been written much earlier, but it hasn't survived. So it's a hugely complex thing. And yes, we in modern times and in modern India have been subjected to British rule and Muslim rule. Neither of them tried to change anything about the religion, but they are both systems in which the sacred is on one side and sort of non-sacred or profane is on another side. And it's in India, whether it's in Hindu, Buddhist, or Jain, the three religions born in India, where you see that there is more accommodation between them, that every sacred site will have things which are not sacred on it. And the other way around, every step well, which is a practical item, will have some sacred images in it as well. So that sharp divide didn't exist.
Or even, making that distinction at all. It's like, why would we call these images not sacred or sacred? They're simply a conceptual distinction that's not made.
Yes, yes. But it's a difficult point to sort of emphasize until you do it with huge amounts of evidence, including all these inscriptions and the fact that love played a part. What better way to show it than to show God and Goddess in embrace? So it then becomes one of the natural things of life rather than being put into a different category.
So it seems to me, I mean, I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist, and sort of went through my training in the 70s, and and what I think was transformative to me, and has of course developed in scholarship in anthropology and other disciplines since, is this recognition that of the conceptual frameworks that we impose on things, and trying to, and it seems to me that what you're doing here is really trying to identify or to understand these images and objects on their own terms, in the terms through which they were understood. And the reason I went in with my question with the male gaze issue is, again, even modern scholarship continues to reimpose conceptual frameworks. So we saw certain ideas about the naked body, for example, in the colonial era, that affect, what's proper to present, or what's sacred, that somehow if it's a naked body, it can't be sacred because that sort of violates British views or something.
By the way, the body is never totally naked. If you look carefully, there's all word naked, throw it out. It's always the body adorned. That's why I call my thing the body adorned. There's a fragment, there'll be a tiny little sort of, translucent sort of thing around. It's there. When you look. Artistic license is something different, but it itself is always adorned. And even if you think that there's no clothing, there always is. You'll see it along the legs, where you'll see that the skirt is there. You'll always see the jewelry. So it's adorned.
I think that's a really excellent example of, I think, the point that you're trying to make, and that I'm trying to reiterate, is that it's to this, say, American gaze or English gaze, that this is a naked body. If the breasts are exposed, it's a naked body. And I think you're recognizing and really emphasizing the adornment, the cultural practices associated with these bodies that operate within a totally different conceptual framework, where it's not a naked body. So I really appreciate your response there. So do we have other people who want to jump in? Okay, well, we can continue for a couple minutes, and I found it really, for me as an anthropologist who really has not studied imagery except a few particular ones that directly link to my own work on Sufism in South Asia. Just having sort of unfolding these what to me are always complex images that I don't know what to make of. So as an outsider, I really appreciated that. But I'm wondering, in what you were talking about, the different narratives that are embedded in these images, and it's sort of a fascinating framework for thinking about them. I sensed in your later presentations, you really are thinking about the historical context in which things are operating. You talked about, where did they get all the copper? I'm wondering, going back to the discussion of the different kinds of narratives, whether you consider, you didn't emphasize in your presentation as much the sort of the context of these different kinds of narratives. And I'm wondering if that's a shift in your own thinking over time, or just how you presented it to us, or something more.
It appears that we have underestimated the ancient artists, because when you take any single site, let's say we take the site of Sanchi, and you can see the same Jataka, the same story told by one artist in a monoscenic mode and by another artist in a continuous mode. Mm-hmm. So it looks like there was a sophistication that we have not acknowledged among these artists. Everybody always looks at the written word. They're always looking for a text. But we seem to think that there's Slesha. Slesha can be there in text, double meaning and so on. The artists are doing also Slesha. There is Slesha, which can be shown that they are particularly doing a thing in a way in which it can be interpreted this way or that way. That they are much more skillful than we have given them. Mm-hmm. We've not been just and fair with them, because we are in a logocentric world. We are in a world in which we tend to think more about text than about anything else. And when you start thinking about text, I mean, it is amazing. I mean, there are monuments today around the world which still haven't been understood properly because people are looking for a text. For instance, let me give you the major example of Borobudur in Java. I mean, this huge Buddhist monument. Everybody's still looking for a text to understand it. What the hell? This thing itself is a text. This is just look at it. I mean, it's got 7 levels. You've got the life of the Buddha in the central level. You've got Jatakas and Avadanas. Then you've got the other narratives. This in itself, I mean, why are you looking for a text? This is the text. So in a way, the fact that we're all guilty of course we use text when we can, because they give you some more information. But as long as one acknowledges the fact that it's possible for the artist to be extremely skillful and to be capable of some of this. I think I wondered, because I think your question was quite different. I went off somewhere else. But
which was fascinating. I was just thinking about the contextualization of these different narrative forms, visual narratives, the visual narrative forms, and whether you're seeing, and I thought your answer was starting to emphasize on the individual creativity of the artist, but I'm wondering if you're also seeing, say, in one time and place, or one place, multiple narrative possibilities within these images, or whether
Yeah.
it tends to be like regional variation or.
No, at Sanchi and at Barhut, particularly, you see the same story. So Sanchi, for instance, has 4 gateways, and it's got scenes from the life of the Buddha or from the Jatakas on that. And the fact that they are repeated from one gateway to another shows that there's not been strong monastic control over, it was an early stage at which individual donors were donating, and they said, my favorite story is this, and several of them just said, I love the Danta Jataka, and so we've got it on 3 of the gateways, and they're done in different ways. So it seems that there was possibilities available to the artists, and I'm assuming that it's the artists themselves or the artists guilds that might have emphasized one more than another, so that many of them were existing at the same time. Mm-hmm. The narrative networks and topographical come into play only when you've got a large space. So you've got a whole wall, you're doing a mural on a wall, you've got enough space to do that sort of thing. If you're doing a small panel this size, there is not that much scope for it, and one of the other modes is done. But yeah, I mean, I think it's also, if you've got a long architrave like at Sanchi, 9 feet across, you can do a lot with it. If you're going to be doing a panel this size, then your possibilities are different. But you can still do monoscenic, or you can do synoptic, or you can do, I've got another few modes of narrative in there. So I don't know. It's I think the artists had the possibilities, and I'm pretty sure that the donor only said, "I want this story. It's my favorite."
Yeah.
And paid for it, and then the artist took over and did what he wanted at that stage with it.
Ishita, you have a question?
Hello, professors, and thank you, Dr. Dehejia, Professor Dehejia, for your masterclass. I must admit I do not know particularly a lot about art and the entire. I am interested in this, but this was a new experience for me, and I really enjoyed. I'm studying. I'm in my first year of PhD, and I'm studying the indigenous religious traditions in the Western Himalayas and their identity and narrativization there. And I thought that looking at narrativization, especially in the Indian context, might be very interesting in terms of art, because a lot of expression of narratives through art happens in the context that I'm studying. And it just occurs to me over and over that temporality and sequence is something that is a very different thing in India, and in your presentation also it was sort of very evident that you don't have to have a very clear sequencing in a very sort of the step-by-step format. It's all almost like it's juxtaposed. Although there is a sequence, it's juxtaposed to sort of problematize the temporality of the plot. Whereas when I study narrativization in sort of the Western context, it's a lot about the idea of giving the emplotment, for example, like giving it a certain sort of sense of like what is driving the narrative temporally and sequentially. So I don't know, like what do you think? Is there a sense of sort of like this coexistence of different episodes in a story which exists in maybe Indian narrativization? Or am I just generalizing this because I'm still toying with this idea a little bit? Is there a sense of like this multiplicity of space and time in a story?
I think so. The other, have you looked at the Pabuji Ka Pard type of narrative. This is in Rajasthan where they have the whole sort of thing. And
Yes.
you can see that there's a very different sort of, you are looking at stuff which is what, 10th, 12th century onwards, or in your own work?
So it's kind of, I'm still formulating what exactly is my time period, because mainly it's my contemporary sort of period in ethnography based on collecting oral sort of traditions and of temple architecture and folk songs and temple masks and stuff. But mainly I'm just looking at what storytelling entails in the Indian context.
For instance, if you're looking, just let me give you another example. You're looking at sort of Nepali pathas, say, in work. You sometimes find that they use the booster-fed-on method. I don't know whether you know that. That is, I'm going to try and show. It goes this way, and then it continues this way, and then goes, it's going around. It's not like it's here, and then it goes there, and then it stops again. So there's this sort of mode of movement. There are a lot of possibilities. And there's also the mode in which there is this central figure, and things refer back to the central figure as well. So you keep coming back. That central figure is larger usually and doesn't need to be repeated each time. In certain cases, it's obvious and comes back. There's in episodes, sometimes you're getting episodes from a single story. Sometimes you get several stories next to each other. There seem to be, it's an interesting thing. The intentionality is something that still we haven't focused enough on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm thinking that maybe we're about out of time and could wrap up, unless you have another thought or question, or Carlos.
Well,
great. Well, thank you so much. And please know I have I think 2 MA students who are really interested in your work, and I think maybe they weren't able to come today. And this is something, as I mentioned in the beginning, is a record, so that we have this as your lecture as a resource. I think you've done an amazing job, kind of giving us a real sense of what you do, and I appreciate it very much.
As long as you know that I absolutely love what I do.
I gathered that, and the fact that you're still publishing so actively, I can see that you are a true intellectual, as I heard somebody say of somebody else the other day. And it's I do have other questions I would be fascinated in pursuing, but maybe we
hope that by the fall we can actually meet for a cup of coffee and do that sort of.
That would be wonderful. Right? Yes.
So good if we could get out of Zoom.
Oh, I know.
It has its advantages, mind you, but okay.
Oh, and Ishita, I wanted to ask you, so which PhD program are you in?
I'm in PhD in religious studies at the University of Edinburgh School of Divinity.
Oh, okay.
Good heavens, that's certainly far away.
Coming in from far away, I thought I'm in the religion department at Columbia, and I thought I don't remember you, but it could just be COVID.
The religion department at Columbia is really nice. I follow a couple of scholars who did their PhD from there. Udi Halperin, I think, he was from that department.
Yeah, I don't know.
You have Yutika Sharma teaching there?
Not in
Not in religion.
not in religious studies, not in the School of Divinity, but probably
In art history.
in art history. I have a friend in art history. I can ask her if she knows about
PhD.
Yuthika. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I do look forward to seeing you in the fall. And
Okay.
thank you all.
Thank you for the discussion.
Thank you.